In the congressional elections of 1890, the voters, especially in the Midwest, replaced many Republicans with Democrats. They were reacting in part to unpopular measures passed by Republican state legislatures, like the prohibition of alcohol and laws requiring businesses to close on Sundays. Voters who were neither Anglo-Saxon nor Protestant rushed back to the Democrats, who had not tried to legislate public morality. Another factor in the Republican setbacks of the 1890s was the growing agrarian discontent in the South and the West. Members of the Farmers' Alliances elected U.S. senators and representatives, the governors of several states, majorities in 4 state legislatures in the West. The Alliance movement provided the foundation for a new political party, the People's or Populist Party. Delegates from different states met in Omaha, Nebraska in 1892 to draft a political platform and nominate candidates for president and vice president for the new party. Populists were determined to do something about the concentration of economic power in the hands of trusts and bankers. Their Omaha platform called for both political and economic reforms. Politically, it demanded an increase in the power of common voters through direct popular election of U.S. senators instead of indirect election by state legislatures, and also the use of initiatives and referendums. These are procedures that allowed citizens to vote directly on proposed laws. Economically, the populist platform was even more ambitious. Populists advocated unlimited coinage of silver to increase the money supply, a graduated income tax, with this idea that the greater a person's income, the higher the percentage of the tax on his or her income. They also advocated for public ownership of railroads by the U.S. government, and telegraph and telephone systems that could be owned and operated by the government. At the time, the populist movement seemed revolutionary, not only for its attack on laissez-faire capitalism, but also for its attempt to form a political alliance between poor whites and poor blacks. In the South, Thomas Watson of Georgia appealed to poor farmers of both races to unite on their common economic grievances by joining the People's Party. In 1892, James Weaver of Iowa was the populist candidate for president, and he won more than 1 million votes and 22 electoral votes, which made him one of the few third-party candidates in U.S. history to win votes in the Electoral College. Nevertheless, the populist ticket lost badly in the South, and they failed to attract urban workers in the North. The fear of populists uniting poor blacks and whites drove conservative Southern Democrats to use every technique to disfranchise African Americans. The 2 major parties provided a rematch between President Harrison and former President Cleveland, and this time Cleveland won a solid victory in both the popular and the electoral vote. He won in part because of the unpopularity of the McKinley Tariff. Cleveland became the first and only former president thus far to return to the White House after having left it. So no sooner did Cleveland take office than the country entered into one of its worst and longest depressions. In the spring and summer of 1893, the stock market crashed. This was the result of overspeculation and dozens of railroads that had gone into bankruptcy as a result of overbuilding. The Depression continued for almost 4 years. Farm foreclosures reached new highs, and the unemployed reached 20% of the workforce. Many people ended up relying on soup kitchens and riding the rails as hobos. President Cleveland was a little bit more conservative than he had been in the 1880s, and so he dealt with the crisis by championing the gold standard. He pretty much adopted a hands-off policy or laissez-faire policy toward the economy. There's a real decline in silver prices, and that encouraged investors to trade their silver dollars for gold dollars. So the gold reserve actually fell to a dangerously low level, and President Cleveland saw no alternative but to repeal the Sherman Silver Purchase Act of 1890. This action failed to stop the gold drain, and the president had to turn to J.P. Morgan, the Wall Street banker, to borrow $65 million worth of gold in order to support the dollar and the gold standard. So this is basically a reverse bailout of the United States. The deal convinced many Americans that the government in Washington was only a tool of rich Eastern bankers. Workers became further disenchanted with Cleveland because he used court injunctions and federal troops to crush the Pullman strike in 1894. So national politics was in transition. That repeal of the Silver Purchase Act and Cleveland's handling of the Depression thoroughly discredited the conservative leadership of the Democratic Party. The Democrats were buried in the congressional elections of 1894 by the Republicans. At the same time, the Populists continued to gain both votes and legislative seats. The stage was really shaped for a major reshaping of party politics in 1896. The election of 1896 was one of the most emotional in U.S. history. It also would mark the beginning of a new era in American politics. Democrats were divided in 1896 between gold Democrats loyal to Cleveland and pro-silver Democrats looking for a leader. Their national convention in Chicago in the summer of 1896 was dominated by the pro-silver forces. Addressing the convention, William Jennings Bryan of Nebraska captured the hearts of the delegates with a speech that ended with these words: "We will answer their demands for a gold standard by saying to them, 'You shall not press down upon the brow of labor this crown of thorns. You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold.'" So powerful was Bryan's cross of gold speech that it made him instantly the Democratic nominee for president, and Bryan was only 36 years old. The Democratic platform favored the unlimited coinage of silver at the traditional but inflationary ratio of 16 ounces of silver to 1 ounce of gold, even though the market price then was about 32 to 1. Thus the Democrats had taken over the leading issue of the Populist platform. Given little choice, the Populist Convention in 1896 also nominated Bryan and conducted a fused campaign for free silver. Unhappy with Bryan and free silver, the conservative faction of gold bug Democrats, including Grover Cleveland, either formed the separate National Democratic Party or voted Republican. So McKinley was elected in 1896. In the last weeks of the campaign, Bryan was hurt by a rise in wheat prices, which made farmers less desperate, and employers telling their workers that factories would shut down if Bryan was elected. On Election Day, McKinley carried all of the Northeast and the Upper Midwest in a decisive victory over Bryan in both the popular vote and the electoral vote. McKinley was lucky to take office just as the economy began to revive. Gold discoveries in Alaska in the 1890s increased the money supply under the gold standard. So that resulted in the inflation that the Silverites had actually wanted. Farm prices rose, factory production increased, and the stock market climbed. The Republicans honored their platform by enacting the Dingley Tariff of 1897. That increased the tariff to more than 46%. And in 1900, it made gold the official standard of the U.S. currency. McKinley was very well liked. He was also a well-traveled president. He tried to bring conflicting interests together. As leader during the war with Spain in 1898, he also helped to make the United States a world power. In the election of 1896, it showed that there were significant short-term and long-term consequences of the American politics of the Gilded Age. 1896 marked the end of the stalemate and stagnation that had characterized politics in the Gilded Age. In addition, the defeat of Bryan and the populist free silver movement initiated an era of Republican dominance of the presidency. The Republicans not only dominated the presidency, they won 7 of the next 9 elections, but they also dominated both houses of Congress. They would dominate 17 of the next 20 sessions. So once the party of free soil, free labor, and free men, the Republicans had now become the party of business and industry, though it continued to advocate for a strong national government. The Democrats carried on in defeat. They were kind of the sectional party of the South and the host of whatever populist sentiment remained. The Populist Party declined after 1896. They soon ceased to be a national party. In the South, Thomas Watson and other populist leaders gave up trying to unite poor whites and blacks. They discovered that the hard lesson of racism was stronger than the common economic interest between poor whites and poor blacks. So ironically, in defeat, much of the populist reform agenda, like the graduated income tax and the popular election of senators, would eventually be adopted by both the Democrats and Republicans during the reform-minded progressive era of 1900 to 1917. The election of 1896 was also a clear victory for big business, urban centers, conservative economics, and moderate middle-class values. It proved really to be the last hope of rural America to reclaim its former dominance in American politics. Some historians see the election marking the triumph of the values of modern industrial and urban America over the rural ideas of America of Jefferson and Jackson. McKinley emerged as the first modern president, an active leader who took the United States from being relatively isolated to becoming a major player in international affairs. So McKinley's master of high finance politics would also create a model for organizing and financing the successful campaign for McKinley. McKinley's model focused on winning favorable publicity in the dominant mass media of his day, which was newspapers.